Wednesday, December 5th. Tonight's On the National, getting the news about cutbacks at the CBC. James Baker grilled on American intentions in the Gulf. And on the Journal, do not adjust your sets. Regular local programming will not resume. The crisis in public broadcasting. The National with Peter Mansbridge.
Good evening. At CBC stations right across the country today, you could have heard a pin drop. Employees listening solemnly to a closed-circuit address from Corporation President Gérard Veilleux. An address reported to contain the biggest cuts ever to Canadian public broadcasting. It did.
Many of you will be affected very directly, since the measure I am announcing today will result in the reduction of the corporate workforce by another 1,100 positions. For that, I am truly sorry.
Most knew the cuts were coming, but few expected these cuts, so wide, so deep. They cost in program terms, in human terms. 1,100 jobs will be lost. 11 stations will either close entirely or be pared to the bone. Depending on where you live, your local CBC outlet may already be gone, replaced by a regional service. Here's a quick look at where that's happening. On the East Coast, 3 stations, Sydney, Nova Scotia, Corner Brook, Newfoundland, Labrador's, Goose Bay, all effectively gone in terms of local programming. In Quebec, 3 French stations, Sept-Îles, Rimouski, and Matin, shut down or all but. In Ontario, the Windsor operation cut by 80%, and Toronto left with only a regional newscast. Viewers in Saskatchewan lost the Saskatoon news broadcast today. For those in Alberta, the Calgary program is no more. Even at stations that weren't shut down, things may never be the same. In Vancouver, for example, 50 positions will be cut. And right across the country, local non-news programming is ending. Veilleux says he has no choice because the CBC has to save $108 million. But the decision will cost a lot of jobs, and for some, it was unbelievable news.
Shocked, surprised, totally in disbelief.
Next thing, they'll be hauling the gear out of here. It's just like tearing up the via tracks. You know, they're just going to try and prevent the public from supporting us, and it really makes me mad that we can't say goodbye.
The job losses are bad, but what those layoffs mean has sparked a much wider debate, from living rooms to the House of Commons. Our coverage begins tonight in Ottawa with the CBC's Keith Bogue.
The Conservative caucus got the news before CBC employees. Gérard Veilleux personally briefed the Tories this morning. A few hours later, he spoke to employees on closed-circuit television.
The CBC of the future will be smaller than the CBC of the past. That seems inevitable.
Then, in a nationally televised news conference, Veilleux gave a public explanation of the cuts. Government restraint has put the squeeze on the CBC, he said. Nothing new in that, but this year there are added difficulties.
What is new this year, in particular, over and above additional government restraint, is the major downturn in the commercial market. And that has to be addressed.
And so, CBC television is out of local programming. Only some local news shows survive the cuts.
The remaining programs in the regions will be news, supper hour shows, and late night news. It's all the rest that is cut out. All other programs is being eliminated.
In the Commons, the CBC cuts took up virtually all of question period.
If he believes in the unity of this country, will his government give the CBC today the money required to maintain these vital services it's cutting?
I wonder if he can explain how the closure of regional stations in Corner Brook, Goose Bay, Sydney, Sept-Îles, Toronto, Saskatoon, and Windsor, as well as other areas, will help the CBC to fulfill its mandate and its role as the heartbeat of Canada.
The Prime Minister said the figures show his government has consistently given more money, not less, to the CBC.
Every year since this government has been here, we have given more money on a yearly basis to the CBC. We have proceeded with the construction of a headquarters in Toronto. We have authorized the creation of News World.
But the opposition said the government has deliberately kept CBC's budget increases lower than the inflation rate, deliberately underfunded it.
103 people in Windsor who have just been told their jobs are dead were told that the major reason for it was the lack of funding from this government.
Times are tough all over, said Mulrooney. All broadcasters are facing what CBC is up against. There is a recession, and CBC cannot escape it.
The action of the government of Canada is not designed to minimize the CBC. It is designed to strengthen the economy so that as the economy strengthens, we can continue to do more for the CBC so that the CBC can continue to play its important role in bringing national unity and strengthening the fibre of the nation.
Other MPs accused Mulrooney of allowing CBC cuts to undermine national unity.
And it is ludicrous to send Keith Spicer and his bloody traveling band, his circus-like band, around this country trying to discover why we're in trouble, when the very reason we're in trouble is that Air Canada's disappeared out of our communities, Via Rail's disappeared out of our communities, CBC has disappeared out of our communities, and the regions of the country have been cut adrift.
Tobin says the CBC is on the road to being privatized. That's not how the chairman of the Commons Communication Committee sees it.
There's no indication to privatize the CBC. I'm not an advocate of privatizing the CBC, but I think they had to live with a little less federal funding.
And it's not going to get any better in the foreseeable future. In fact, if the economy doesn't improve and if federal funding stays flat, Vea says the CBC will be looking at another $50 million in cuts by 1992. Keith Bogue, CBC News, Ottawa.
The CBC says it has been playing a brutal numbers game for years. It says it has to save. There was nothing optional about it. It had to save $108 million in the fiscal year that begins next April. Here's why. The continuing spending cuts of the federal government, that's $32 million. Inflation, everything costs more, but there's no extra money to cover extra costs, that's $18 million. Declining television advertising as the economy weakens, $30 million. New costs like higher taxes and expenses to keep buildings up to standards, $16 million. And an adjustment in payments to the CBC pension fund, that's $12 million. The suddenness of the massive cuts caught CBC employees by surprise. Quite literally, people who had jobs yesterday found out today they'll have to look for new ones. Like so many thousands of other Canadians out of work during a recession. That story now beginning with Susan Ormiston in Atlantic Canada.
CBC staff in Sydney were bracing for the cuts. What they didn't expect was to be pulled off the air tonight.
We were history as of last night. We didn't know it.
Instead, most of the television staff were told to go home.
Well, I think it was handled abysmally. I think it was callous and uncaring and unfeeling.
In St. John's, Newfoundland, the cuts were worse than expected.
We had no idea it was going to be anything like this.
All regional TV shows except news are gone, including the popular Land and Sea programs in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, programs on the air for more than 20 years.
I didn't hear any mention of the Newfoundland audience who have come to rely on the kind of work that we do in this province. I'm just poisoned.
Smaller stations such as Goose Bay and Corner Brook won't do any more homegrown TV programming, and that rankles.
The government is bent on decimation of the country, I guess.
But there is talk in places such as Sydney of a movement to fight back.
I think the federal politicians don't need another front to start fighting on. So I think that there is enough support here that can be garnered and turned against the politicians so that they can change their mind.
But by showtime tonight, the halls at the CBC were nearly empty, as shock and anger gave way to resignation. Susan Ormiston, CBC News, Sydney.
In Calgary, they were preparing a local daily newscast when the CBC's national news service reported the cuts would be immediate.
That's the first I hear of that.
It took many a while to recover from the sudden realization that their jobs were finished right there and then. In Saskatoon, there was anger. Anger that their station, too, is closing. Anger over how they found out about it.
And I think it's really shitty that I didn't learn that I had no job tomorrow until 5 minutes before I had no job tomorrow.
We will not have a supper hour out of here tonight.
The Windsor CBC station lost its newscast and 80 employees, too. It was the only local Canadian television news in the city across the river from Detroit.
How are the people of the city of Windsor going to feel Canadian now?
A sentiment echoed by Windsor Mayor John Milson.
There is no way that our community has any lifeline to Canadian culture anymore.
In Toronto, the newsroom was silent as word spread that all local programs, with the exception of local news, had ended.
With the CBC being cut and cut and cut, Canada becomes less and less distinct.
Obviously, a down and dirty political decision. There's no...
In the West, some callers to open-line radio programs expressed support for the CBC. But there were also comments that these cuts are the same as what many other Canadians are facing.
And thousands of educated, qualified people that get laid off every day, and I don't hear anybody squawking.
And that's what some viewers said, too.
Yeah, there's a lot of that happening lately.
Some of the employees had wanted to do one more newscast to say goodbye to their audience.
I feel appalled by the idea that we just evaporate and we have nothing, no last word. Let us write our own epitaph. We'd like to do that.
But CBC management refused. So with nothing else to do, hundreds of journalists and technicians packed up and went home. Kevin Newman, CBC News, Calgary.
All this has touched off a debate about the future of public broadcasting in Canada. Everyone agrees the CBC will never be the same, but they don't agree on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Tom Kennedy reports.
For those who created it, the CBC was to be the glue helping to hold the country together, the vehicle to show Canada to Canadians. A former president of the CBC, Al Johnson, said today the network's job has suddenly become more difficult.
But the CBC has been bleeding to death for the last 3 years through savage budget cuts. If you undermine the CBC, you undermine Canada. And that's what's been going on.
Johnson and others worry now about the future of public broadcasting, whether a network that does not live on commercial revenue can survive in Canada. 5 years ago, a federal task force on broadcasting recommended that the CBC expand its services. Today, GERRY Kaplan, who headed the task force, says the cuts will have serious consequences.
I have a real fear that public broadcasting is slipping away. The president of the CBC himself said that there is far more to come in terms of cuts. I don't know where they're going to come from since they claim all the fat is gone, local television programming is gone. What's going to be left?
But many private broadcasters are not alarmed by the cuts. They never objected to the CBC's national mandate, but they did object to the local competition. Local programming, they believe, should be done by the private sector.
If the move is to concentrate the resources on CBC's national service and regional services and not on local, this is the right move.
But even though they'll be getting a larger piece of local markets, private broadcasters are not gloating.
Everybody's hurting because the market is more and more fragmented. Inevitably, CBC was going to have to change, as we will.
What that means is that, like the CBC, private networks are expecting to lay off people too. One network president said today that after a decade of growth, the television industry, both private and public, is beginning to shrink. Tom Kennedy, CBC News, Toronto.
Are going to feel Canadian now, that they've lost their TV station.
The newsrooms across the country are the bare bones of the operation, and they're cutting bare bones now.
It feels horrible. We were making a major contribution journalistically in Saskatoon, and it's a tragedy.
I didn't hear any mention of the Newfoundland audience who have come to rely on the kind of work that we do in this province. I'm just poisoned.
Good evening, I'm Bill Cameron. Across Canada today, 10 local newsrooms and a score of public affairs programs disappeared, ceased to exist. Have CBC cutbacks caused these areas affected to lose a powerful and significant voice in this country? Tonight, in the face of the worst financial cuts in the CBC's history, we'll look at the future of the CBC. Has the corporation been changed forever? Have today's cuts created a crisis in public broadcasting? We'll talk to a broadcast historian and to someone who knows what it's like to make the painful choice between what goes on the air and satisfying financial reality. And we'll hear from some of the areas affected so badly today. We begin our coverage tonight with the president of the CBC, Gerard Villa. He is in our Ottawa studio. Mr. Villa, you're in a particularly complicated position here because when you were at the Treasury Board before you joined the CBC, you were in a position to supervise some of the cuts that were going to be required of the CBC. Did you have a sense then that this would be the result?
Well, one has to be careful here, Bill. The cuts that were announced last year as a result of the Wilson budget of 1989, we announced how we would carry out those cuts last year. The new factor this year is obviously the continuation of this restraint, budgetary restraint, but also a significant downturn in the economy, which has caused a downturn in the commercial revenues that we rely on for our television. So that has combined to add a very significant impact.
Well, I understand that, but you had a look in the books and you realized that you were going to require this size of cut, and that if there was a downturn in the economy, a failure in commercial revenue, that the results would be extremely severe.
Well, look, I don't think anybody was predicting a downturn in the economy. Certainly that's not the job that I had before, nor the job that I have now. I just live the consequences of those downturns, and they caused me a great deal of pain that has produced this announcement today.
Well, I'm sure. Now, proponents of public broadcasting say this is conclusive proof that public broadcasting in Canada ought not to be dependent on commercial revenues, because when there's a downturn in the economy, the institution runs into a disaster.
Well, that's certainly a position that I've heard. The fact of the matter is that we now rely to the extent of about 30% on commercial revenues. I have declared myself that I thought that was probably a little too much. Whether we should be out completely is a matter for discussion, probably for the longer term. The fact is that we are now facing a situation for 1991-92 that is very serious, and I consulted with the senior staff of the CBC and Radio-Canada, and placed before the board of directors the recommendation that you have seen today.
You've outlined a new corporation, and you've explained a philosophy that led you to these cuts. Well, now we go on, most of us.
Yes.
What should this new CBC be? What role should it play in the country?
Well, I think you will see that it will continue to play a very significant role, and indeed we'll see regional television perform a broader mandate than it has performed now. Radio is largely untouched, as you see. We will build on the complementarity of our two media. We're the only corporation who has these two media coast to coast. So I think we owe it to our people and to the country to build on this system and have it in a complementary way. So the television will be out of local. That's true, and it's sad, but then it will reflect a new dimension of regionalism that is very prevalent in this country that perhaps we have not seen adequately on television.
Well,
and in that sense, public television will play a very relevant and significant role.
Sure, but something told you when you were making your choices that if you had to get a lot of money, the place to get it was in local television. Somehow local television was a lower priority or perhaps less appropriate for expenditure than other parts of the CBC. Was that just bookkeeping, or is there a philosophy here?
Well, no, I did say in my statement that this is more than a mere accounting exercise. There is a philosophy. I think the three principles that we have outlined today are evidence that this was very much generated or inspired by a vision of the role that both radio and television can play in this country. Television will continue to play. Look, if you address the range of options from a purely accounting point of view, you say overhead, well, we have exhausted that avenue. Across-the-board cuts, that would have crippled CBC in a way that I think would have been disastrous. Network in Toronto and Montreal, well, the whole country depends on network productions to have its television in this country. So we didn't have this option. So the other option we had to maintain the relevance of public television in this country was to diminish the local television that we have in Canada and concentrate it on regional and national and even international. So I think it's going to be a very significant role.
What you're saying then was that your only real choice was to demolish the network or demolish the regions.
Well, or do a bit of both, or attack radio.
Well, here in the network, we know we're going to take a hit, but it's not going to be 1,100 jobs. You have clearly decided that it's the local television end which is going to leave.
That's correct. And I think that's clear in what we have announced today. Radio will focus and concentrate on local, and television will vacate the local and concentrate on regional, and the two will build on each other.
I guess one of the things that some people in the regions are saying is that When you move from local to national media, television in particular, there's a kind of a flattening out effect. The country becomes more homogeneous, you lose local accents, you lose local beliefs, local customs, and finally you have a kind of just a mass that goes from coast to coast with no sensitivity towards local beliefs and aspirations.
Well, that may be true, but that at the same time, if you were to hold that position, Bill, then perhaps one would argue that you know, the production of everything in Toronto, which fortunately is not the case, would have that effect. I don't agree. I think you can have a reflection of various regions of the country through your programming, and indeed the English network does that quite well, and English radio does that quite well. You don't have to have bricks and mortar in one place to reflect that region to the rest of the country. Now, it's sad that we have to take some of this out. I regret it, but circumstances force it on us, like it forces it on most business in this country.
Mr. Villa, thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you.
The hope expressed by the President that the cutbacks will create the best possible CBC may be a hard sell in regions across the country. We're joined by three people whose local news operations were closed today. From Ottawa, John Milson, the Mayor of Windsor, Ontario. From Calgary, by Kevin Peterson, the publisher of the Calgary Herald. And from Sydney, Nova Scotia, by Parker Barth-Dunham. He's staff writer for Reader's Digest. Mr. Peterson, there are a lot of unhappy people in Calgary tonight.
There are an awful lot of unhappy people in Calgary tonight, and they had one less newscast than they had last night. It's a travesty. One of the roles of the CBC is to enable the regions to communicate with each other and to send their message back to central Canada. The decisions today abrogate that role, and the regions are now left on their own. I think it's terrible.
Mr. Dunham?
Well, just feel exactly the same way. This is a very special and unusual area of Canada. It's about as different from Halifax as it could be. It might as well be on different planets, the city of Sydney and the city of Halifax. And the notion that we can be served by a regional program from there is just false.
Mayor Wilson, first reaction from you as well.
Citizens in Windsor are just outraged. There's no other way of explaining it. We feel isolated enough. We're in kind of an island surrounded by the United States, and the CBC was our really only true link, not only to the rest of Canada, but also to local news. And when we're inundated every single day with the American news on the wires, it's just devastating for us. And I'll tell you, the citizens of Windsor are just tremendously outraged and certainly won't stand still for this.
Kevin Peterson, let me see if I can put the argument for this as I understand it. Granted that Calgary is distinct, unusual, specific as a region, but you don't necessarily need a television station to remain that way.
Well, I think you probably do. The recent history of Canada shows how important the energy industry is to this country. That industry has a story to tell the country, and it's not going to be told. It can be said, of course, there's still a station in Edmonton, but anybody who's spent a weekend in both cities knows that Edmonton and Calgary are dramatically different places.
But there will be CBC television reporters in Calgary reporting on Calgary business and other stories for the rest of the country.
Yeah, there'll be something like 2 reporters in Calgary. The Calgary Herald maintains 3 reporters in Edmonton. I don't think that serves the national interest at all. And it certainly allows Calgary no chance to put its message to the rest of the country, not just Toronto and Ottawa, but the other regions of the country.
Parker Dunham, do you think a message is being sent here to the regions?
Well, I think that this is certainly part of a, you know, people say Brian Mulroney has no vision. I've always thought that was wrong. I think he has a very clear and radical vision of Canada, and it's a very different kind of Canada than the one I know and love, and part of it is having no national railway system, part of it is having no national broadcaster.
Well, I think what the response from the federal government might be to that is, look, we're requiring the CBC to cut some money, but we haven't told the CBC how to do it. The CBC decided to cut the Sydney television service.
Well, I mean, they've been telling them and telling them and telling them to cut money year after year after year. At some point, they have to make decisions that really hurt, and this one will really, really hurt. There's a model here for what happens when you do this, because CTV did it about 5 years ago. They cut their local Sydney station. Now they serve all 4 Atlantic provinces out of Halifax. A survey showed that all of Cape Breton Island gets approximately 12 minutes a week of news coverage on that regional program.
Mayor Milson, assuming that the CBC does have to cut money, a lot of money, what would you cut instead?
There is production costs. There's over $100 million, from what I'm told, in production costs that could be altered. but most importantly, they have an opportunity to make some money, to generate some additional dollars through proper programming, through a super, what they call a super station, which has been looked at in the city of Windsor and is seen to be profitable and make money.
This is a mug's game anyway. The CBC's been cut and cut and cut and cut. You know, there's a political ideology at work here, and if you don't see it, you're not looking.
Well, sure. I mean, Via Rail, the Post Office, Air Canada have all been cut one way or another, and all are dropping their regional operations. Why should the CBC be any different, I guess?
What makes the CBC different, Bill, is the CBC is the way that Canadians communicate with each other.
Exactly.
It's all well and good for us out in the hinterlands to have the message sent us from Ottawa and Toronto, but there are other messages in this country. And if the CBC's not there to pick up those messages, if the local newsrooms aren't there to follow the stories and bring those stories to the attention of the rest of the country, to Ottawa, Toronto, and to the other regions, it's a tremendous loss for this country.
And these radical, destructive things are being done by a government that it currently enjoys the support of maybe 13% of the population. It's just outrageous.
I guess that gets me to my next question. If the government thought, Kevin Peterson, that these cuts were going to be as unpopular as you say they will be, do you think they would have gone ahead and done them?
I don't think they would have, no.
Again, just to remind you, they asked for a large cut and offered the CBC free carte blanche in how to do it, but still.
They went to a Crown corporation and said, here, you make the cuts. And perhaps there is a political game being played in terms of, okay, if you're going to force us to do it, we do have to cut off an arm or a leg. Well, that's what's happened, and it's bad for the country. I don't know whether it's the CBC that's to blame or whether it's the politicians that are to blame. But what I do know is that Canada is not as good a place today as it was yesterday because of this decision.
Mr. Milson, this seems to be a done deal. I haven't seen any indication from anyone in power that there's any possibility to get these cuts eliminated. Are you going to take it, just accept it?
No, we're not. We don't in Windsor just accept cuts. We didn't with Via Rail. That's why there was no cuts in the Windsor to Quebec corridor, because we fought for it. We'll fight for this one as well. And in the CRTC amendments, I think that we have some flexibility there because the City of Windsor has absolutely no Canadian CBC local content whatsoever. We don't have another Canadian station at all that even gets down to our area. So therefore, we would be cut off completely, and I think that we have an opportunity there. Another thing, too, the shows that are purchased from the States and are run on your Toronto CBC, they don't come down to Windsor because of territorial rights through Detroit. I presume they're going to have dead air time in Windsor. I can't see how they're going to produce a show without any kind of local content.
Mr. Dunham, last word to you.
Well, they tried to do this in Sydney about 6 years ago, and the community rallied and stopped it. The CBC, in a very gratuitous, cruel gesture, tried to short-circuit that by not even allowing the programs to go on air across the country and say goodbye. I'm sure there will be a big uproar. It may be the next election before we're able to do anything about it.
Bill, one last thing. Talk about cruel. You know, they passed our 11 o'clock, on the 11 o'clock newscast last night, they passed a note to the newscaster announcing this through him. That was the first indication that the staff even had anything so imminent, and now today they're not even on the 6 o'clock news to read their own obituaries.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much. Good night.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
Good night.
When we come back, we'll turn from regional anger to an examination of the uneasy future of the CBC. Today's cutbacks to the CBC are the latest in a series of belt-tightening moves the corporation has been undergoing for several years now. Cuts during financial hard times are not unexpected, but there are differing opinions about whether or not these cuts have gone too far. Some people might even argue they haven't gone far enough. We continue our coverage now with 4 veterans of the public broadcasting debate. In our studio, Paul Rutherford. He's history professor at the University of Toronto, author of When Television Was Young, and Jerry Kaplan, co-author of the 1986 Kaplan-Sauvageau Report on Broadcasting Policy. In Ottawa, we're joined by Al Johnson, former president of the CBC, and in Toronto, Howard Astor. He's professor of political science at McMaster University, a former member of the CBC's board of directors. Al Johnson, the reaction here and in CBC stations across the country was, of course, grief and anger. You used to be president. What was your reaction?
My reaction was one of anger, too. The fundamental issue of these cuts is the failure on the part of the Government of Canada to recognize the importance of the CBC as a central Canadian institution. You know, when it comes right down to it, if you undermine the CBC, you're undermining Canadian programming. And if you're undermining Canadian programming, you're undermining the country as a whole.
Jerry Kaplan?
I'm with Al. We spent a lot of time in our report making recommendations which have been completely ignored. After us, a parliamentary committee, a majority of them were Conservatives, made a whole series of recommendations which have been completely ignored. I don't see how you can resist the argument that the government doesn't give a damn about the CBC, doesn't understand public broadcasting, probably resents public broadcasting, and I don't know if it's too conspiratorial, maybe it implies too much intelligence on their part, Bill, to say that with the free trade deal and with deregulation of airlines and with with railways being cut back, we now have a vociferous Canada. We now have barely anything called Canada. We have east-west links that are shriveled. We have north-south links that are strengthening. And a blow to the CBC is something we couldn't afford at this time.
Paul Rutherford, they've rolled up a lot of local television news operations. Your reaction to that?
Well, I'm sad at the human tragedy. I'm not particularly pleased with another victory for the Tory agenda, but I do think that a streamlined CBC is a better CBC. The CBC should not have been in local and regional programming anyway. Its mandate is to provide a national service in 2 languages, and now it can focus on that.
Howard Astor, I'm sure you've heard those arguments as well.
I've heard them often enough, and it's a very, very sad day for the CBC and also for Canada. The president of the corporation, I think, hit the nail on the head when he said this is a fundamental restructuring of the corporation. I think he was trying to be optimistic. I want to be pessimistic. I think the corporation now is significantly different from what it was yesterday. And I would go further and argue that it's probably it's on the way to a fundamental shakedown, which will change it dramatically.
Let me try to make the case the way the government has been making the case. The government has been saying times are tough, the deficit is dangerously high, public and private companies all over the world are having to cut back. Al Johnson, surely the CBC has to be part of that process.
Look, when a government says that everybody has to bear their fair share, what they're really doing is confessing to across-the-board cuts. And when you confess to across-the-board cuts, you're really saying that you're mindless, that you're incapable of establishing priorities, that you're incapable of saying what is most important. You know, take my native province of Saskatchewan. Before the last election, the Government of Canada said we're going to give $1 billion to the production of private production of sour crude on the Saskatchewan-Alberta border. That was $1 billion. Here we have cuts that are occasioned by government reductions in funding that close the Saskatoon station and close the Calgary station. Now, what sense does that make in terms of priorities?
Look, can we pursue it? You make choices in government, I take it. I now have friends in Ontario who have government. They have tough choices to make, so I'm no longer quite as glib and irresponsible as I used to be. Nevertheless, you make choices. You keep troops in Europe for something called NATO for reasons that do not any longer exist. It costs you $5 billion a year. You send troops to the Middle East because you're fighting for a freedom or whatever, and nobody asks the costs. When you need to appoint more senators, you appoint $1 million more senators, and you have the money somewhere. You have money if you need it. I don't pretend you could have $1 billion or $10 billion for the CBC. You can't have everything, but if you understand its purpose, there should be enough money to fund it. They don't understand, nor to repeat, care about its purpose, and it's doomed. The second step, I don't want to go too far in the conversation now, is the $50 million that they're threatening to cut next year. Bill, who's next?
Howard Astor, you were a member of the board of directors until last year. Mm-hmm. What kind of CBC do you think the government wants?
Well, I'm not sure. I think the government really knows what kind of CBC it wants. I don't think it has, in some sense, a master plan other than some tentative directions. One direction, it seems to me, is a trimmed-down one, whatever that means. What that means, basically, is you cut off pieces of it. So you cut out local programming, you cut out RCI, you cut out whatever is hanging out, as it were. Then what you're left with is fundamentally a network, radio and a television network. Problem there, of course, is that it's contrary to the basic mandate, I think, of the corporation, which is to have roots within regions, roots within various communities. But you can go further than that, of course, and argue that the direction of the corporation is to rely more and more on basically revenue accruing from selling of advertising. I think that's the imminent danger. If you look at the corporate budget, roughly about a third, 30% of the corporation now is funded through advertising revenue. Radio, it seems to me, is next on the line. I would envisage that radio will be once again commercialized. I think that the corporation will have to rely more and more on advertising revenue in the near future.
Okay,
and
well, but let me make sure that we spend enough time on the cuts that were announced today. We have enough grief at the moment. Paul Rutherford, you would argue that these cuts, the way they were implemented, the choices that were made, moves the CBC closer to its true mandate.
Closer to its true mandate. Its mandate was initially to provide a national service in English and French across the country. At least the English across the country, the French largely for Quebec. And it should maintain that. It only went into local and regional programming in a big way in the late 50s and early 60s, in large part because of the competition of private television and the belief at the time by the directors that this was the way to establish themselves in the public mind. It hasn't worked.
Well, when you eliminate local CBC television news, you're saying that these things are better done by the private broadcasters. What's your evidence for that?
No, I'm not necessarily saying they're better done, and I should specify that I think this is a loss. It's a loss in every community. When you lose a voice, print or broadcast voice, it is a loss. So this is not something that I cheer. But the point I'm making is that what is more important, the issue of priorities, is national service, not the locality. And if you have to cut, it is far better, far more sensible to hack off a limb than it is to reduce, to put the whole corporation on a diet. A 10% across-the-board cut would be disastrous.
But excuse me, but in the final analysis, you have got to have provincial and local stations if you're going to reflect Canada to Canada. That's absolutely fundamental. One of my favorite arguments is that to contemplate a CBC without provincial and local stations is like contemplating Canada without provinces. The two go together. They're utterly fundamental.
Well, you were president and you cut yourself. You cut something on the order of $71 million.
That's
so you're
right.
kind of a specialist here in looking at this process.
I'm a veteran anyway.
You have to take $108 million out of the CBC budget. Is this the way you would have done it?
Well, we were at an earlier stage when the CBC hadn't been hacked as much as it has been now. But essentially what we did was to cut capital expenditures and to do some selective cuts in programming using more repeats and so on. But quite clearly, in the longer run, the choice is between the cutting of regions, which means you're not reflecting the country in that way, or the cutting of programming such as drama, which you are failing, means you're not reflecting Canada in that way.
Well, they made that choice. Do you think they made the right one?
Well, you see, I'm not going to get into a discussion about the choice.
Right.
No, I'm not.
Jerry Kaplan kind of tempt you into this.
You can tell me a little bit. You asked one question of Al Johnson that I think needs some historical perspective. Every year since the Tories came in, and they came in hating and loathing the CBC, they thought it as some pinko organization that was out to get them. For every year they've cut something. This was the fat CBC, this was the bureaucratic CBC, and every year some part of the body was cut off. So what's happened today is not new. It's not as if for the first time in 10 years there's been a slash. It's been cut, and it's been cut, and it's been cut. And the question one has to ask the government of the CBC is whether they didn't go to the Prime Minister and say, look, when I, Gérald Veilleux, and I, Patrick Watson, agreed to take these jobs a year ago, you said this wouldn't happen. You didn't tell us anything like this would happen. You promised us we could maintain something called a public broadcaster in a serious way. And I don't know that that's happened. And I think it's somebody has gotten scammed here in a serious way.
But if the government doesn't like the CBC and doesn't like public and semi-public institutions, and we've seen this with VIA and the NFB and the Canada Council and so on down the line, how can you expect the CBC management to do much more than implement a cut? They could resign, that is one alternative, but quite frankly, under the circumstances, they did the most sensible thing they can. They went back to their basic mandate.
But there are issues, it seems to me. It's not an automatic cut. I mean, what has to happen is you set out priorities, and you say, in terms of what is essential, fundamental for the corporation, this stands, this falls. Let's be realistic. I mean, the decision was taken that the regional and local areas will be hurt. And that's what this cut is all about. But at the same time, other areas of the corporation were protected. Sports broadcasting, one can go on endlessly. The corporation is a large billion-dollar-plus corporation, and the decisions were taken. The issue really is, was this the correct decision? And it seems to me Al Johnson is correct.
Well, Professor, let me move to Professor Rutherford, because you feel largely the decisions taken here were correct, even in the absence of a budget squeeze.
Yes.
You would argue that these cuts ought to have been made.
In an ideal circumstance, I would have liked to see local and regional programming cut and the resources and personnel and money devoted to boosting the national service.
Which is not happening.
But it's not happening.
No, that's right.
It's not an ideal situation. That's why it's so sad.
So you have a zero-sum game in which nothing is added and something is lost. Paul may be right about history, but you're now talking about community-based stations that have existed. They have become part of their community. I have watched them across the country. They are integral to it. They have trained journalists who have risen through the system. They've trained technicians who've risen through the system. The system is run by CBC local people. That's been the training ground. It's all lost. It's all lost. The whole grassroots of the CBC is being cut away and nothing replaced, Bill.
All right, well, I've talked to a lot of people who've lost jobs today, and they have said, we have worked hard, we have done excellent things under difficult conditions, and it hasn't been rewarded, it's been punished. At what point does it no longer make sense, Jerry Kaplan, to have a public television or radio function in Canada? Are we just close to the point where the whole exercise becomes pointless?
I'd answer it this way. If we were today starting a new study of broadcasting, I think we would have very different and less expansive recommendations that we did 4 years ago now. I think one would want to relook at the possibilities in a very constrained economy and probably come out with a different kind of public broadcaster. The thing that makes me unhappy, and I sense all four of us share this, is it's not being done in that thoughtful, coherent way. Nobody's sitting back saying, here's what public broadcasting means. The government says you gotta cut. And these guys are slashing all over the place. It's not going to leave us. What we need is a sensible system.
Paul Rutherford, let's talk about this $50 million that may be required of the CBC this time next year if the economy doesn't get any better and if the government doesn't give us more money. $50 million, I suspect, at a minimum. What do you suspect the CBC will look like 2 or 3 years from now?
Well, it all depends on whether the Tories are still in power. The longer the Tories are in power, the more the likelihood of the CBC declining and withering away or becoming merely like CTV. The more that's likely. And this is frightening. What I see $50 million coming out, it has to come out of something. The most expensive form of programming is drama. It is expensive in terms of the time it occupies, what it costs. You could fill that time with American imports, so we move away from Canadianization of the airwaves. We have more commercialization of the airwaves. The CBC looks more and more like other networks. Why do we need it? That's what worries me.
Al Johnson?
And this is precisely what is going to happen unless the parliamentarians decide what they're going to say to the government. I sat in front of parliamentary committees for 7 years. I found that by and large the parliamentarians assumed that the CBC was going to survive almost no matter what was done to it. They were prepared to advance their criticisms about the CBC, and that's fair game. But what they failed to do, it seemed to me, was to discuss the fundamental importance of broadcasting to nationhood and to the expression of a national culture. And until the parliamentarians do that, of course the CBC is going to remain vulnerable to the cuts of this government.
Al Johnson, thank you. Howard Astor, thank you very much. Gentlemen, both of you were
many sleepless nights. More than 1,000 people are losing their jobs, and a national institution is reeling. Words of war. Washington says if negotiations with Iraq fail, any military action would be quick and decisive. And the lessons of the Montreal massacre.
How many isolated incidents does it take to reach the conclusion that, in fact, they're not isolated, that there's a tremendous connection to all of them?
Almost 1 year later, there's still no consensus on what it meant and why it happened.
CTV News with Lloyd Robertson.
Good evening. The cuts are deep, and they're being felt right across the country. Canada's major public broadcaster is slashing its budget. The CBC says falling revenues and cuts in government funding have hurt. So local stations are closing, local newscasts are going off the air, and a lot of people are losing their jobs. Here is what's being axed and where. The cuts add up to $108 million. As to jobs, about 1,100 will be gone. The stations in Goose Bay, Labrador and Matane, Quebec have been closed down completely. All local production at CBC Toronto is being cut, although the network will step in with news coverage there. And there have been drastic cuts to these stations: Corner Brook, Newfoundland, Sydney, Nova Scotia, Sept-Îles, Quebec, Rimouski, Quebec, Windsor, Ontario, Saskatoon, Calgary, and the French language station in Toronto. Those stations have been reduced basically to news bureaus. They'll cover local events, but viewers in those cities will watch that local programming on regional stations, stations which could be hundreds of kilometers away. As to other local programming, all of it is gone, even at the stations that still exist. Only news programming will be done. Larry Stout reports on a dark day at the CBC.
I am truly sorry.
Sullen, shocked, depressed. CBC employees across the country gathered to hear an apologetic Gérard Veilleux confirm the drastic cuts.
I don't mind telling you that these decisions have given me many sleepless nights.
And there will be many sleepless nights ahead for the 1,100 CBC workers who will lose their jobs. Some were bitter, blaming the Mulroney government.
It's a personal vendetta against the corporation. By Mulroney. By Mulroney.
Most were simply sad, finding it unbelievable the budget axe had been wielded with such force.
We've been through cuts, constant cuts here for the last, well, since 1985. A lot of people have gone. I think, you know, I understand that argument, certainly initially when these cuts started, but I don't understand it anymore.
Ça nous a fait plaisir de vous servir pendant 20 ans. Je pense que c'est un...
CBC Toronto's French-language TV news was immediately shut down. Future service will come from Ottawa.
I find it fairly brutal, fairly rude. We don't even have a chance to go on the air and thank our viewers.
CBC's Calgary station will also be sacrificed, as will the station in Saskatoon. Regional operations are being reduced so that each province has just one main station.
I'm Hillary Brown in Toronto. Welcome to our new viewers in Windsor.
Even CBC's flagship Toronto station will be reduced to a regional news operation. All other local programming has been canceled, including an award-winning local documentary program.
Hi, this week, the face of unemployment.
It's not a great time to be in television as a journalist, is it?
In Windsor, reduced now to a news bureau, there is concern the community will be even more overwhelmed by American programs from Detroit. Others claim the CBC closures pose an even greater danger to Canadian unity.
At the very moment when we've got Mr. Spicer going around trying to figure out what it is Canadians want, it's the very moment that we're cutting off the access that Canadians have to finding out what it is to be a Canadian.
CBC unions say they'll take the corporation to court to stop the cuts. But according to CBC Chairman-designate Patrick Watson, there's no alternative. Sad as they are, the cutbacks, he says, are essential to the corporation's future health. The CBC hasn't been silenced, its voice and influence simply muted. Larry Stout, CTV News, Toronto.
One area that could be silenced is...
The Axeman cometh. Barely 1 year after becoming CBC president, Gérard Veilleux finds himself presiding at what critics call the dismantling of the broadcasting organization he leads.
But we felt we had no choice. We must balance our budget. The severity of our financial situation requires these unprecedented measures to bring the corporation's operating costs in line with available resources.
The CBC president portrays his network downsizing as a restructuring, one that'll change the CBC permanently.
Here, regretfully, we have to cut to the very center of our institution by making major reductions in programming. There is no question that these changes will have a profound and permanent impact on the CBC. The CBC of the future will be smaller than the CBC of the past.
For opposition politicians, though, this was the broadcasting equivalent of the cuts at Via Rail. They accuse the Conservative government of tearing up the electronic ties that bind.
This is part of this government's effort, its campaign to dismantle vital national institutions and unravel the very fabric of this country.
Is it not the real objective of this government that sees the country as a monopoly board to privatize the CBC?
The Prime Minister said the CBC, like other government agencies, had to face up to hard times. Its billion-dollar-plus budget, he said, had outgrown the ability of Ottawa to fund it.
Indeed, there is a recession, and all elements of society, including the CBC, must deal with this new reality, which means tightening our belt.
As if this bitter medicine for the CBC's budget ills was not bad enough, its staffers may have to spend the next 2 years facing the prospect of more of the same. The CBC president says unless the economy rebounds dramatically or the federal government comes up with more money, he is forecasting a shortfall of $50 million by 1992. And he says that will have to be dealt with. Craig Oliver, CTV News, Ottawa.
With me from Ottawa is Tony Atherton, television writer for the Ottawa Citizen. These cuts at the CBC have the look of a basic reshuffling of priorities. How do you see them?
Well, I think that there definitely was a reshuffling of priorities, Lloyd. Even Mr. Veilleux indicated that that was the case. Basically what they've done is they've emphasized network programming and regional programming and virtually eliminated local programming.
Well, apart from the pain administered by these cuts, which no one could ignore, 1,100 people after all, do you see any positive aspect to it?
Well, I think the positive thing is that they finally dealt with something that's been hanging over their heads for a long time. You know yourself that these kinds of issues were raised by the former president, Pierre Junot, in past years. These things were coming. He gave dire warnings at the time. Nothing too much was done initially, and now at least they finally dealt with it in some way.
The knock against the CBC has always been that if it would take an axe to its bureaucracy, it would have lots of money for programming. Do you think the bureaucracy has been cut to the bone?
Well, no, it certainly hasn't been cut to the bone, and there would be a lot of people that would argue that there's still room to maneuver there. But I don't think the kind of cuts that are left at CBC head office would be enough to meet the kind of